the day her world went offline. Seattle. A gray Wednesday morning in December. Rain tapped softly against the apartment window, reflecting the dull silver lights of an empty street. Inside her small third-floor apartment, Grace Morgan, 65, set a kettle on the stove and opened her old laptop. The familiar startup sound pulsed through the quiet room, a heartbeat of routine for a retired woman who now lived alone, finding small joys in the online world. She had once been a literature teacher at Roosevelt High School. After 30 years in the classroom, Grace no longer graded papers or heard students laughing in the hallways. Instead, she taught a few free online lessons for underprivileged kids, to keep the mind from rusting. As she liked to say. On the screen appeared the list of familiar faces: Evelyn, Jake, Noah. "Good morning, kids," she said, her voice gentle but trembling. No one answered. The connection was weak, the image broken into fragments. Then, pop, a small explosion came from the corner of the kitchen. Grace turned. A burnt smell crept into the air. She thought the kettle had overflowed onto the electric stove. But within seconds, a dark column of smoke was rising from the wall socket. She hurried to shut off the power, and a sharp boom blew out the lights. Fire began licking the curtains. Like a wild animal awakening from sleep, it breathed, stretched, and devoured the air. Grace screamed, grabbed the fire extinguisher under the sink. Nothing came out. "This can't be happening," she whispered, as the smoke thickened like a nightmare taking form. Every piece of her life, the photo with her late husband, the books her students had gifted her, the framed teaching certificate, all caught the red light, then turned to ash. For a few suspended seconds, sound disappeared, only the crackling roar of fire and the weight of heat pressing against her lungs remained. Coughing violently, she staggered toward the window. The lock had jammed, refusing to open, as if even the door wanted to keep her inside her loneliness. She slammed her fist against the glass. It shattered, raining down like ice. She crawled out onto the balcony, wind slicing through her hair. Below, people had gathered. Someone shouted, "There's a woman up there. Call the fire department." She looked down at the street, the same street where she used to take her students for autumn walks, now bathed in the red glow of flames. When the fire trucks arrived, Grace stood trembling on the sidewalk, wrapped in a blanket handed to her by a neighbor. The blaze consumed the building, reflected in her clouded eyes. Time stretched endlessly as sirens wailed. A firefighter placed a soot-stained hand on her shoulder. "We did everything we could, ma'am, but your apartment, there's nothing left to save." She nodded without speaking. In her pocket was a melted USB drive, the only copy of the manuscript she'd been writing, The Kindness That Remains. The rain began to fall harder, mixing with smoke, dripping onto her white hair. In Grace's eyes, it wasn't just her apartment burning. It was 40 years of teaching, 20 years of motherhood, 10 years of widowhood, and one single minute for all of it to vanish. She looked around. Nobody spoke. People lifted their phones, recording, live streaming, commenting. A young man approached her. "Are you okay, ma'am? I'm filming for TikTok. Do you want to say something?" Grace met the camera lens, her eyes swollen red, and said quietly, "Not every fire deserves to be shared." The boy lowered his phone and slipped away. Night fell. The rescue workers brought her to a temporary shelter. They gave her a small plastic bag, toothbrush, bottled water, a cheap prepaid phone, for emergencies. She sat on a folding bed, surrounded by the coughs and sighs of strangers. She turned on the phone. The screen lit up with a message, "Please connect to Wi-Fi." Grace let out a hollow laugh through her tears. The whole world, it seemed, was connected, except her. Outside, emergency lights still flashed red against the rain. Inside, a 65-year-old woman stared into the darkness where her home used to be and thought, "If fire has a soul, perhaps it only wanted to tell me, it's time to begin again." The next morning, Grace awoke to the muffled sound of snoring and the clinking of metal trays. The temporary shelter smelled faintly of bleach and damp clothing, a scent of exhaustion and defeat. Around her, Strangers shifted in their narrow cots, clutching thin blankets like shields against an uncaring world. She sat up slowly. Her body ached from the hard mattress, her mind from the weight of silence. On the small table beside her lay the few things she now owned: a borrowed coat, a bottle of water, and the burnt remains of her purse. Everything else, her books, photos, letters, had been swallowed by the fire. Grace looked around and saw others like her, the forgotten generation. A man with a prosthetic leg reading a newspaper from 2009. A woman in a pink cardigan muttering to herself, "My husband's coming back soon." Though no one ever came, the shelter was full of stories that had stopped being listened to. A young volunteer approached with a clipboard. "Mrs. Morgan, right? The Red Cross can help arrange temporary housing. Do you have family we can contact?" Grace hesitated. "My daughter," she said softly, "but she's busy." Busy, such a small word for such a large emptiness. That afternoon, Grace sat near the window of the shelter, holding the emergency phone they'd given her. The rain outside blurred the city lights, making everything look like watercolor left out in the storm. She opened her contacts, but there were none. The phone was blank, like her new life. Finally, she typed in a number from memory and pressed call. "Mom?" Her daughter's voice was clear, polished, hurried. Grace could almost picture her. Laura, 38. Stylish, sharp, always talking about deadlines and meetings. "Oh, thank God you picked up," Grace said, her throat tight. "Laura, there's been a fire. My apartment's gone." There was silence on the other end, not shock, just calculation. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine. I'm at a shelter for now. They said I might stay a few days. But after that." "Mom, I'm in a meeting right now. Can I call you later? I just need to finish this pitch." Grace swallowed. "Of course, I just wanted to hear your voice. Love you, Mom. I'll text you soon, okay?" The line clicked. The phone's screen dimmed. Grace stared at her reflection in the black glass. Text you soon. That used to mean something. That night, she sat at one of the cafeteria tables where volunteers handed out paper cups of soup. Around her, everyone ate in silence. The only light came from the flickering TV mounted high on the wall, showing a panel of young influencers debating the rise of digital empathy. One of them said, "Technology helps us care more than ever before," and the audience applauded. Grace stared up at the screen, watching their bright smiles, feeling something tighten inside her chest. Technology had connected the world, but not her. She was the ghost of a previous generation. The human version of an old operating system no one bothered to update. When she returned to her cot, a young man was sitting there, scrolling through his phone. He was probably in his 20s, wrapped in a hoodie with the logo of a gaming company. "Sorry," he said when he noticed her. "I just needed an outlet to charge this. Battery died." Grace smiled faintly. "That makes two of us." He looked up, confused, then smiled back, shyly. "You're funny." "Not really, just outdated," she said. The following day, Grace received an email notification, the only one she had left from her old account. She'd managed to log in on one of the shelter's public computers. It was from the apartment management company. Per policy, tenant belongings remaining on site after fire damage will be cleared within 48 hours. There was nothing left to clear, but the message stung nonetheless. Bureaucracy, like time, was merciless. Grace wandered outside for the first time in days. The sky was a washed-out gray, and the city hummed with the rhythm of people who had somewhere to be. She walked past cafes full of laptops and laughter, past store windows displaying gadgets that could do everything but comfort a lonely soul. In one cafe, she caught her reflection in the glass, a woman with tired eyes, soot-streaked hair, and a posture that seemed to apologize for existing. For a brief second, she didn't recognize herself. Then she noticed the posters outside, ads for AI companions, bringing empathy back to your life. She couldn't help but laugh. Empathy for $9.99 a month, she murmured. That evening, she returned to the shelter and found a letter on her cot. It was from a local community worker. Someone had seen her story on the local news. We can offer a temporary shared housing placement. The letter read, 1 bedroom available in a young couple's apartment. They're willing to host an elderly tenant. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. Grace looked around the shelter, the weary faces, the echo of coughs, the distant siren of another ambulance. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket. Maybe this was her way out of the smoke. But as she lay down that night, the thought returned, soft but persistent. You lost your home, Grace, but maybe the world has lost something too, the ability to care. Outside, rain whispered against the roof again. Inside, under a flickering light, a woman without an address closed her eyes and waited for morning, not to arrive anywhere, but simply to belong again. The apartment stood on the edge of Capitol Hill, sleek, modern, and smelling faintly of lavender-scented candles. The young couple, Megan and Tyler, greeted Grace at the door with polite smiles and the awkwardness of people trying to be generous without wanting to be. Please, come in, Megan said, gesturing toward the small living room. It's not much, but it's warm. Grace stepped inside, holding her single bag of belongings. The apartment was everything her old home wasn't: minimalist, curated, untouched by time. A white sofa, abstract art, a potted plant that looked too perfect to be real. She felt out of place immediately. Even the air seemed filtered, too clean for someone who still carried the faint smell of smoke in her hair. Thank you, Grace murmured. I really appreciate this. Of course, Tyler replied, already glancing at his phone. It's just until you get back on your feet. Those words, just until, settled in her chest like a pebble dropped into deep water. That first evening, Megan showed her to the small den that had been turned into a guest room. A fold-out couch, a blanket, a lamp. We usually use this as an office, she explained quickly. You'll have privacy though. The bathroom's right down the hall. Grace nodded. It's perfect, really. But perfect was a lie. When the door closed, she sat on the edge of the couch and let the silence press down. The apartment was full of distant sounds, the soft hum of a dishwasher, the muted clicks of laptop keys, the laughter of two people sharing a life she no longer understood. She opened the old flip phone they'd given her at the shelter. No messages, no calls. The world had gone quiet, except for the echo of her own breathing. In the mornings, she tried to help, washing dishes, folding laundry, watering plants. Megan would smile politely, then rearrange everything again after her. You really don't have to do that, she'd say. I like keeping busy, Grace would reply. But, keeping busy, had always been her way of pretending she still mattered. On the third day, Tyler came home from work with takeout. We're eating sushi tonight, he said cheerfully. Grace smiled. That sounds lovely. At dinner, they talked about stock markets, influencer marketing, and the new AI tool that could write articles faster than humans. Grace listened quietly, nodding, pretending to understand. When she tried to speak, about teaching, about literature, their attention drifted back to their glowing screens. It wasn't cruelty, it was absence, the new form of indifference. A week passed. Grace noticed the subtle changes. The way Megan began closing her office door during Zoom calls. The way Tyler's smile faded faster each morning. One evening, Megan approached her with a strained smile. We really love having you here, Grace, but Tyler's mom might visit next week, and we'll need the space. Grace froze. Of course, I understand. Megan hesitated. You've been wonderful, really. I just hope you find something soon. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay on the couch, watching the city lights flicker through the blinds. Her mind wandered to her old students, the ones who used to bring her flowers on Teacher's Day. The ones who said she'd changed their lives. Did any of them still remember her? She turned on her phone. Still nothing. The silence of technology was louder than the fire ever was. 2 days later, when she returned from a walk, she found a note on the kitchen counter. Dear Grace, we're so sorry, but something came up. We'll have to end the arrangement earlier than planned. Please understand, we need our space back. There's a small hostel near Pine Street, Maybe try there. We've left a little money in the envelope for the taxi. Take care, M&T. Grace read the note twice. Then again. It wasn't anger she felt, it was the quiet sting of being disposable. She sat down on the couch for the last time. The plant beside the window swayed slightly in the breeze from the air purifier. On the coffee table, their wedding photo smiled at her. Two young people promising each other forever. While she couldn't even find a place for a night. Outside, the evening air was sharp. Grace walked without knowing where she was going. The city glowed with neon light, open 24 hours. Charging station, cozy co-living spaces. Future starts here. But for people like her, the future had already started, and ended, somewhere in the middle of yesterday. She found herself standing in front of a coffee shop that never closed. Inside, a few people sat hunched over laptops, lost in their own worlds. Grace went in, ordered the cheapest drink on the menu, and took a seat by the window. The warmth of the cup in her hands felt like company. Outside, rain began to fall again, Seattle's unending lullaby. Through the glass, she watched reflections of people rushing by with umbrellas, earbuds, and purpose. They looked like ghosts of another universe, connected by wires, untethered by hearts. She whispered to herself, almost smiling. Temporary kindness is still kindness, until it ends. Then she took a deep breath, opened her little notebook, and began to write. Day 10. Homeless, not hopeless. The coffee shop became her refuge. Not because it was warm, but because it didn't ask questions. The baristas changed shifts, the customers came and went, but no one ever asked why the gray-haired woman sat by the same corner table every night, writing in a small notebook and refilling the same cup of black coffee until morning. Grace liked the anonymity. When no one looks at you, you can look at the world freely. Through the window, she observed the rhythm of a city that never truly slept. Delivery riders darting through rain. Students buried in screens. Couples taking photos of their food instead of each other. The world moved fast, like a movie she no longer had a ticket to watch. Each night, she wrote small reflections, not for anyone else, just to keep her mind alive. The world doesn't grow colder. We just stop standing close enough to feel its warmth. People talk more, but listen less. Even kindness now needs Wi-Fi. The notebook became her new home, the only place she could still arrange things neatly. One line at a time. By day, Grace wandered through the city. She visited libraries, museums, and public parks, pretending she was simply out for a stroll. In the library, she'd read the local newspaper and quietly correct the grammar mistakes in her mind. Old habits die hardest. She overheard two students arguing at the next table about AI taking creative jobs. One said, "Teachers are next. Robots can explain everything better." Grace smiled faintly. Robots can explain, but can they care? She thought. Her reflection in the library window startled her. The fluorescent lights made her hair look whiter, her eyes more tired. In that reflection, she saw two versions of herself, the teacher she once was, standing tall with chalk on her fingers, and the woman she'd become, invisible, disposable, surviving on leftover warmth. It was strange, she thought, how loneliness doesn't arrive all at once. It sneaks in quietly, one cancelled call, one empty inbox, one polite smile that doesn't meet the eyes. One night, as she was packing up her things from the cafe, the young barista, Ethan, lingered near her table. "You're here almost every night," he said, hesitant. "You writing a book or something?" Grace looked up, surprised by the sudden attention. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe I'm just remembering one." Ethan grinned. "That's deep. You sound like my grandma. She used to keep journals too." Said it helped her talk to herself without judgment. Grace chuckled. "Your grandmother sounds wise." "She passed away last year," he said softly. They both fell silent. Then Ethan added, "If you ever need an extra cup, don't worry about paying. We throw out so much coffee every night anyway." Grace's eyes softened. "That's kind of you." He shrugged. "Temporary kindness is better than none. Right?" His words lingered long after he walked away. By the end of the month, Grace had nowhere left to stay. The hostel Megan had mentioned was full. The shelter's beds were all taken. So she returned to the 24-hour cafe each night, sleeping for an hour or two at her table when the crowd thinned. She had learned to make herself small, to take up less space, to move quietly, to exist without interrupting. Sometimes, she'd wake up before dawn to the hum of espresso machines and the faint music playing overhead. Those early hours were her favorite. The world was still half asleep. And for a short time, no one expected her to be anything. One morning, as the first light crept through the rain-soaked windows, she noticed a crumpled magazine near her table. Someone had left it behind. The headline read, "The Last Gentleman of Sociology, Dr. Samuel Reed on Human Connection in a Digital Age." The name hit her like a quiet thunder. Samuel Reed. She hadn't thought of that name in over 40 years. He was her first love. They'd met in college when she was studying English literature, and he was a sociology major obsessed with questions about human empathy. He used to say, "Technology will bring us closer, but only if we remember how to touch." At 22, Grace didn't understand what he meant. At 65, she finally did. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the article. There he was, older, silver-haired, but unmistakably him. His eyes still carried that same warmth she remembered, the kind that made people feel seen. The article said he had become a respected professor and author, giving talks about emotional poverty in the modern world. One quote stood out. "The greatest tragedy of our time is not that people stop feeling, it's that they stop believing anyone cares." Grace's breath caught in her throat. It felt as if the universe had slipped her a note through that abandoned magazine. A message written just for her. That night, she returned to her table in the corner. The magazine folded neatly in her bag. The coffee shop buzzed with noise, but she barely heard it. She opened her notebook and wrote one line at the top of a fresh page. "What if the person who once taught me how to feel is the only one who can remind me who I am?" For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel invisible. She felt something stir, faint but real. Hope. The magazine stayed in her bag for days. Like a heartbeat she couldn't bring herself to touch. Every night, Grace read and reread the same lines about Dr. Samuel Reed, tracing his photograph with her finger as though she could feel time through ink. He looked older now, his hair silvered, his face more lined, but his eyes, those were still his. The same thoughtful gaze that once made her feel as if the whole world fit inside one conversation. They hadn't spoken since 1981. Back then, he was a dreamer with a scholarship. She was a young teacher with rent to pay. He'd asked her to move with him to Chicago when he got his first research position. She'd said no, her mother was ill. And stability seemed safer than love. He left quietly, without resentment, only a final letter. "You were the first person who made me believe kindness could be permanent. Don't ever let the world make you hard." She had kept that letter for decades, folded inside a poetry book. The book had burned with her apartment. And yet here he was again, like a ghost of everything she'd lost and everything she'd never dared to reach for. One evening, after finishing her coffee at the 24-hour cafe, Grace borrowed a pen and scrap of receipt paper. Her hands shook slightly as she began writing an email address she found printed at the end of the magazine article. sreed@portlandu.edu. The address looked too official, too distant. Still, she couldn't ignore the pull in her chest. She opened her laptop, the one she'd been able to salvage from the fire. Though it bore a faint burn mark across its lid, and logged into an old email account she hadn't used in years. The password? She smiled to herself. "Be kind 1979. The same phrase she used to tell her students every morning. Her cursor blinked in the blank message window. For 15 minutes, she stared at it, uncertain how to begin. How do you write to the person you once loved before your life burned down? Finally, she typed. Subject: a voice from a long time ago. Dear Samuel. You probably don't remember me. But I saw an article about you today, about your work, your research, and your thoughts on empathy. I just wanted to tell you that. Even after 40 years, I still remember your words. Kindness can outlive anything. I wanted to believe that again. I hope you're well. Grace Morgan, Thorne. Back then. She hovered over the send button. Heart racing. Then she clicked. The message whooshed away into the unseen ether, disappearing like a paper boat down a dark river. Days passed. Nothing came back. Grace told herself it was foolish to expect a reply. Maybe the email bounced. Maybe he didn't remember her at all. But at night, when the cafe quieted and the rain pressed gently against the windows, she caught herself checking her inbox over and over, as if hope itself had a sound. On the third night, it did. Ping. Her hands trembled as she opened the notification. Subject. Of course I remember. Grace. I was about to leave my office when I saw your message. Do I remember you? I could never forget you. I still have the first edition of Frost's poems you gave me when I left for Chicago. It's on my bookshelf as I write this. I'm so sorry about what you've gone through. The fire, the loss. I can't imagine. If you'll let me, I'd like to see you again. I'm in Portland now, not far. Samuel. Grace read the message again and again. Every word felt like light touching skin after too long in darkness. She sat in the cafe until dawn, smiling through tears that wouldn't stop. That morning, she packed her small bag. Not much to take: a notebook, a change of clothes, the burned laptop, and the magazine that had changed everything. She took one last look at the corner where she had sat for weeks. The chair that had become her anchor in a drifting world. Goodbye, she whispered, not to anyone in particular, but to the version of herself who had survived there. At the station, the ticket clerk glanced at her. Destination? Portland, she said, and for the first time in months, her voice didn't shake. The train rolled out of Seattle under a soft drizzle. Grace sat by the window, watching the gray coastline blur past. The rhythm of the tracks reminded her of old times, long conversations on late-night trains with Samuel. Both of them too young to know what forever meant. Across the aisle, a college girl was live-streaming herself, heading to Portland for the weekend. Guys. Grace smiled faintly. She wondered what it must feel like to live in a world where nothing was private and everything was instant, where a person could announce their existence to thousands, yet still feel unseen. Outside, the sky began to clear. For the first time since the fire, sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling golden light over the wet fields. Grace pressed her hand against the windowpane and whispered, "I'm coming home." The train hummed steadily along the gray Oregon coastline, slicing through mist and forest like a silver thread stitching together the past and the present. Grace sat by the window, her reflection merging with the shifting scenery, half ghost, half survivor. Outside, the sky was still bruised from morning rain, but thin beams of sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering across the glass. Every station the train passed felt like another chapter being closed. Tacoma, Olympia, Vancouver, names she had once known, now just signposts to a life that was no longer hers. The seat beside her was empty. That suited her fine. She'd spent most of her life taking care of others, her students, her husband, her daughter, but this journey was hers alone. Across the aisle sat an old man reading a newspaper. He glanced at her occasionally, as if trying to place her. Finally, he said, "Traveling far?" Grace smiled faintly. "Far enough to start over." He chuckled softly. "At your age, that's bravery or madness?" "Maybe both," she replied. They fell into small talk. He was visiting his granddaughter. He'd been a bus driver for 35 years before retirement. When she mentioned the fire, he shook his head. "You lost your home, but you didn't lose yourself. Most people do." His words lingered long after he left the train 2 stations later. The train's rhythm lulled her into memory. 40 years ago, another journey, another window. She could still see Samuel as he was then, tall, awkward, brilliant. They had met in a student debate about technology and empathy. He argued that machines would eventually mimic care, but never feel it. She had stood and said, "Maybe the problem isn't machines replacing empathy. Maybe it's humans forgetting how to use it. He'd followed her after class. You should have been a philosopher. I'd rather be a teacher, she'd replied. He had smiled in that slow, deliberate way that made her heart do impossible things. Then teach me. They spent 3 years teaching each other about poetry, kindness, courage, and the quiet art of listening. Then life, as it always does, interrupted. The train stopped briefly in Centralia. Grace stepped out to stretch her legs. The platform smelled of coffee and diesel, but somewhere in that scent was a trace of nostalgia. She watched a young couple kiss goodbye, their laughter echoing as the whistle blew. She thought of how long it had been since anyone had waited for her at a station. When she climbed back into her seat, a folded piece of paper rested on her tray table, left behind, perhaps, by the old man who had sat nearby earlier. It was a quote scribbled in shaky handwriting. Every arrival begins with a leaving. Grace smiled. Maybe he knew she needed that. As the train approached Portland, the world outside began to glow with late afternoon light. The rain had stopped, rivers glistened, trees bent gently in the wind like old souls whispering, "Welcome back." Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Samuel. Grace. I'll be waiting at Union Station. Platform 4. Look for a blue scarf." She read it twice, her pulse quickening. It was such a simple message, yet her hands trembled as if holding something sacred. 40 years had compressed into a single moment, a promise she thought life had forgotten to deliver. The train slowed. The conductor's voice came over the intercom. "Next stop, Portland Union Station." Grace gathered her things, her small bag, her notebook, the burned laptop she couldn't bear to throw away. She checked her reflection one last time in the window. Lines carved deep around her mouth, eyes a little dimmer, but still alive. She smoothed her hair, dabbed at the faint lipstick she'd found in her purse, and whispered, half laughing, "Well, Grace, let's see if the universe still keeps receipts." The train hissed to a stop. Doors opened. Passengers shuffled out with the urgency of people who had somewhere to be. Grace stepped down onto the platform, her legs shaky, her breath shallow. Crowds moved around her, but the world had gone quiet. And then she saw him. Standing by a pillar, a blue scarf looped around his neck. Samuel Reed looked almost exactly as she had imagined, older. Yes, but solid, kind-eyed, real. He turned, as if sensing her before seeing her. Their eyes met. In that single second, the 40 years between them disappeared, like a bridge reappearing after fog. She wanted to run to him, to say something clever or poetic, but all that came out was a soft, trembling whisper. "Samuel." He smiled, the same smile that had once undone her entirely. "Grace," he said, his voice deep but tender, carrying the warmth of everything she'd been missing. "You made it." And then, quietly, he added the same 3 words she'd once dreamed of hearing when her life was smoke and ashes. "You came home." For a moment, Grace couldn't move. The platform around her blurred, the noise, the motion, the voices, all dissolving into stillness. It was as if the world had paused to let one fragile reunion unfold in its own time. Samuel walked toward her slowly, his hands tucked into the pockets of a navy coat, his blue scarf fluttering in the wind. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough for her to see the years etched into his face, not sharp lines of aging, but soft ones, like rivers tracing the landscape of a life well lived. He smiled first, that same patient, steady smile that once made her feel safe when the world was uncertain. "Grace Thorne," he said softly, using her maiden name, the one no one had called her in decades. Her throat tightened. "You still remember some names," he said, "the heart never forgets how to pronounce." She laughed, but the sound trembled, carried on a breath that felt half sob. The drive from the station to Samuel's home was quiet at first. The sun was setting, painting the Portland sky in strokes of violet and gold. Grace sat in the passenger seat of his car, a silver hybrid that hummed softly, like the mechanical equivalent of his calm demeanor. He glanced at her occasionally, his eyes full of gentle curiosity. as if afraid that speaking too soon would break the delicate spell of this moment. Finally, she said, "I didn't think you'd actually come." He smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "I didn't think you'd actually write." They both laughed quietly. The laughter felt new and familiar at the same time, like returning to a song you hadn't heard in decades but still remembered every lyric. He told her about his life, how he had spent years teaching sociology, writing books about empathy and social fragmentation, how his students teased him for still using a fountain pen. "I told them," he said with a smirk, "that ink remembers in a way screens never will." Grace nodded. "You never changed." "Oh, I did," he replied. "I just tried to change in the direction of myself." When they arrived at his house, the air smelled faintly of cedar and rain-soaked earth. The home stood on the edge of Forest Park, a two-story wooden house surrounded by pines. No gates, no guards, no luxury, just peace. As he opened the door, a soft chime rang, not electronic, but an old brass bell tied with a blue ribbon. "I never replaced it," he said, "still the same one you gave me for Christmas in 1980. Grace froze. "You kept that?" He nodded. "It reminded me that some sounds don't fade." She stepped inside. The interior was simple but warm, bookshelves from floor to ceiling, a stone fireplace, a piano in the corner, and a faint trace of vanilla in the air. On the walls hung framed photographs, students, landscapes, a few newspaper clippings of his lectures. And then, on the mantelpiece, she saw it, the first edition of Robert Frost's poems she had given him before he left for Chicago. The edges were worn, the cover faded, but it was unmistakably the same book. Her voice broke. "You really did keep everything." He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something that reached far beyond nostalgia. Everything that mattered. They sat by the fireplace that night, 2 cups of tea between them. Outside, rain began again, a soft, rhythmic drumming against the windows, steady and reassuring. "Tell me about your life," he said. Grace hesitated, then began, slowly, like peeling layers from an onion. She spoke of Robert, the husband she had loved in a quiet, dependable way, of her son, David, successful but distant, of the years that passed like one long sigh. When she reached the fire, the house burning, the silence afterward, she stopped. Samuel didn't interrupt, he simply listened, and in that listening, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, seen. When she finished, she laughed bitterly. "I must sound pathetic." He shook his head. "You sound alive." "Alive?" she echoed. "I've lost everything." He leaned forward slightly. "Then you're freer than most." She blinked. "Free?" He nodded. "We spend our lives building cages and calling them homes. You've lost the cage, Grace. Maybe now you can finally live in the open." The words landed somewhere deep, where reason couldn't reach. After a pause, he reached for a small wooden box on the table and opened it. Inside lay a collection of objects, small keepsakes, letters, notes. He handed her one. It was a photograph, slightly faded, of the 2 of them from their university days, sitting on a campus bench, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. "I found it last week," he said. "It fell out of one of my old notebooks." Grace traced the edges of the photo. "We looked so unafraid." He smiled. We thought time was endless. And loss was something that happened to other people. "Do you ever wish we had stayed together?" she asked softly. Samuel didn't answer immediately. He stared into the fire, its reflection dancing in his eyes. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but then I remind myself, we wouldn't be who we are now. Maybe we had to lose each other to meet again at the right time." Grace felt tears rising but didn't fight them. "And this, now, you think it's the right time?" He turned to her, his voice a whisper. "Grace, I've waited 40 years. If this isn't the right time, I don't think one exists." When she went to bed that night, in the guest room overlooking the forest, the house was utterly still. Only the sound of rain on leaves filled the air. She stood by the window, looking out at the trees swaying under the soft drizzle. Her reflection in the glass was faint, ghostly, but for the first time in months, she didn't see a stranger. On the desk beside the bed was a folded note. In Samuel's handwriting. It read, "The fire took your house. Not your home. Rest here, until you remember the difference." Grace smiled, touched the paper gently, and whispered into the quiet room. Maybe home isn't a place after all. The first morning in Samuel's home felt unreal, not because it was grand, but because it was still. The kind of stillness that didn't feel empty, but intentional, like the pause between two breaths. Grace woke to the faint sound of birds and the smell of coffee wafting from downstairs. For a few seconds, she just lay there, staring at the wooden ceiling, tracing the grain patterns with her eyes. This is what peace sounds like, she thought. No sirens, no shelter noise, no screens glowing in the dark. Just life, slow, ordinary, alive. She got up, dressed in the same jeans she'd worn since Seattle, and hesitated before opening the door. But as she stepped into the hallway, she heard Samuel humming in the kitchen, and something in her chest unclenched. He was standing by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, wearing an apron that said, "Empathy, the original AI." Grace laughed softly. "You actually own that?" "Gift from my students," he said. "I wear it to remind them who invented feelings." They had breakfast together, toast, fresh fruit, and a silence that wasn't awkward. The kind of silence that meant you didn't have to perform. "You'll stay here as long as you need," Samuel said simply. "There's no rush to decide anything." Grace stirred her coffee. "I don't want to be a burden." He looked at her, eyes steady. "Then don't think of it as staying. Think of it as returning." The days that followed unfolded gently, like pages turning themselves. Grace helped around the house, tending to the plants, reorganizing his bookshelves, cooking simple dinners. Samuel, for his part, introduced her to his world. Lectures, articles, the endless papers he was still writing about human disconnection. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fireplace. He'd read aloud passages from his essays, and she'd edit them with a red pen, her teacher's instinct waking from long sleep. One night, she teased, "You know, for a man who studies empathy, your commas are heartless." He grinned. "Good thing I married syntax to meaning back in college." "You never did marry," she said. "Maybe I was waiting for the editor who got away." Her cheeks warmed. 40 years had passed, and somehow he still knew how to make her blush like a girl. It wasn't all laughter, though. Some nights, the firelight revealed the cracks they both carried. Grace struggled with guilt. Guilt for depending on someone again. Guilt for the years lost. Samuel had his own ghosts. A lifetime of people who left once they realized empathy doesn't pay well. One night, Grace asked, "Do you ever regret not having children?" He smiled faintly. "Once. But then I realized the world doesn't need more people. It needs more kindness. And that's what I tried to teach." She looked at him, realizing how different their lives had been. Hers devoted to structure. His to searching. Yet somehow, both roads had led them here. To this quiet intersection of second chances. As winter deepened, Samuel began encouraging her to write again. "You have something to say," he insisted. "You've lived through what I only write about." And so she did. She started a small online blog. A thing she barely understood but was determined to learn. Samuel helped her set it up, laughing as she typed with 2 fingers. "What should I call it?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "How about the fire that freed me?" Grace hesitated. "That sounds dramatic." "So was surviving it," he replied gently. The first post went up a week later. It wasn't long, just a few hundred words. "When I lost everything, I thought I had nothing left to give. But then I realized, even ashes can be soil. From loss, something new can grow, sometimes even love." They didn't expect anyone to read it. But within days, hundreds of comments appeared. Some were short. "This made me cry." Others told stories, of fires, divorces, grief, recovery. One woman wrote, "I thought I was the only one starting over at 70. Thank you for reminding me I'm not." Grace was stunned. She hadn't written for fame. She'd written to remember herself. Now strangers were finding their own reflections in her words. Samuel watched her reading the comments. eyes shining. "You see," he said softly. "Empathy doesn't fade, it just waits to be spoken again." Her blog grew. She wrote every night, about the kindness of strangers, the cruelty of indifference, and the strange beauty of beginning again when the world thinks you're finished. She didn't hide her age, she embraced it. "I am not young, but I am new. The world still burns, but I no longer run from the fire, I listen to it." Soon, journalists reached out. One wanted to do a feature on the woman who turned disaster into dialogue. Grace almost refused, but Samuel said, "Maybe your story isn't yours anymore. Maybe it belongs to everyone who's still afraid to start over." The interview aired one rainy Sunday morning. When Grace saw herself on TV, sitting by the same fireplace where she now drank her tea, she felt oddly detached, as if watching someone else's life. Yet something inside her shifted. For years, she had thought she'd already lived her story. Now she realized she was only in the second act. That night, she and Samuel sat outside under the porch light. The forest shimmered with mist, and the air smelled of rain and pine. "Do you ever think," she asked, "that maybe life gives us back what we were too young to keep the first time?" He smiled. "I think sometimes it gives us better." She reached out, took his hand, and held it. For the first time in decades, she didn't feel like someone's guest. She felt home. The morning after the television interview, Grace woke to find her phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand. Dozens of messages, hundreds of notifications. People from across the country thanking her for her story. But one message froze her heart. From David Morgan. Subject: Mom. She hadn't heard from her son in weeks, not since the night he told her that his house was a sanctuary, too small to include her grief. For a long time, she just stared at the name on the screen, the way someone might study an old scar, unsure whether it still hurts. Then she opened it. "I saw you on TV. You looked different, happier. Victoria and I wanted to call but didn't know what to say. Can we talk?" Her hands trembled slightly as she set the phone down. "Different, happier." He said it like it was a miracle. Maybe it was. Later that morning, she found Samuel in the garden, pruning a row of rose bushes. His hair was tousled, a smudge of soil on his cheek. He looked at her and smiled. "You're famous." "I'm old," she corrected. "That's not the same thing." She hesitated, then handed him the phone. David wrote. Samuel read the message quietly, then looked up. "Will you answer?" Grace sighed. "I don't know. I thought I was done being the mother who waits." He set the shears down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said gently, "Maybe you're not waiting this time. Maybe you're choosing." She thought about that the rest of the day. That evening, after dinner, she called him. "Mom?" His voice was careful, as if testing whether she'd hang up. "Hello, David." There was a pause. "You look good." The interview, it was beautiful. "I wasn't trying to look good," she said softly. "I was trying to be honest." He sighed. "I know, and I wasn't. Not with you. I'm sorry, Mom. We were scared. About our space. Our lives. Our plans. It was selfish." Grace looked out the window. The sun had just dipped below the trees, painting the forest in gold and blue. "Fear makes people cruel, David. I know that now, but it also teaches you what love really means. It's the opposite of fear. Not the absence of it." He was quiet for a long time. Then, in a small voice, "Can I come visit?" She smiled faintly. "You can always visit, David. Just don't come to fix me. I'm not broken anymore." When she hung up, Samuel was standing by the door, 2 cups of tea in hand. "How'd it go?" She took a sip, smiled. "He's trying. That's enough." He nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Grace froze. "Samuel?" "Before you say anything," he said, his voice calm but trembling slightly, "I'm not trying to fix you either. You don't need saving. I just want to build the rest of this story with you, while we still have chapters left." He opened the box. Inside was a silver ring. Simple and elegant. "I don't believe in promises," he continued, "only in continuations. So, Grace, will you continue with me?" Her eyes filled. "You waited 40 years to ask that question." He smiled softly. "And I'd wait 40 more if it meant this moment." They married quietly 3 weeks later. In the backyard beneath the tall cedar trees. It was early spring. The kind of day where the air smells of new beginnings and the ground still remembers winter. There were only 4 guests: the local pastor, Samuel's colleague, Maria the housekeeper, and, to Grace's surprise, David. He came alone. No Victoria, no pretense, just a son trying to find his way back. When he hugged her before the ceremony, she felt his body shake. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I know," she said, "but we don't apologize for yesterday at weddings. We bless tomorrow." Samuel took her hand as the pastor spoke. The vows were short, but they didn't need to be long. They'd already lived most of the words. When it came time to speak, Grace said simply, "Sometimes, fire takes everything. Sometimes, it leaves a spark that refuses to die. You were that spark, Samuel." And he replied, "You were the reason I kept the light on." After the ceremony, David helped clear the chairs. He watched them laughing together. 2 people who should have been too old for this kind of joy. "Mom," he said, approaching her quietly, "I didn't know love could still look like that." Grace smiled. "That's because love doesn't age. Only people do." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Can I come visit again? Maybe next month?" She touched his cheek, the way she used to when he was a boy. "Next month, or any month, but bring less guilt and more time." He laughed through tears. "Deal." As he drove away, Samuel wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "You okay?" She looked up at the fading sun. "Better than okay. For the first time in my life. I think I'm exactly where I belong." That night, as they sat by the fire, Grace rested her head on Samuel's shoulder. The flames flickered softly, casting gold across the walls. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think fire only destroys." Samuel looked down at her. "And now?" She smiled. "Now I think it redecorates." He laughed, that deep, unguarded laugh she had missed for 4 decades. And for the first time since the day her old life turned to ash. Grace didn't just feel safe, she felt alive. The morning light spilled across the kitchen table, touching everything in gold. 2 mugs of coffee, an open newspaper, and the hands of 2 people who had finally found their way home. Grace sat across from Samuel, still wearing her wedding ring like it was a quiet miracle. Outside, the forest breathed, wet, green, alive. It had been 3 months since the wedding. The rhythm of their new life was gentle, ordinary, and yet every moment carried the gravity of gratitude. Grace cooked breakfast while Samuel read her the morning headlines, occasionally muttering at the absurdity of the world. "War in 3 countries, floods in another," he said, shaking his head. "Humans never stop burning what they should protect." Grace stirred her oatmeal and smiled faintly. "Maybe some of us have to burn first before we learn how to protect anything." He looked at her then, not just at her face, but at the strength that lived behind it. "You talk like someone who's been through the fire." "I have," she said softly, "but this time, I came out glowing." Her blog, "The Fire That Freed Me," had grown far beyond what either of them imagined. Tens of thousands of readers followed her now. People wrote from all over, sharing stories of loss, divorce, illness, loneliness, and how her words made them feel less alone. Grace spent her mornings replying to comments. Not out of duty but out of empathy. She refused to let her readers be just usernames. To her, each message was a small life crossing hers for a moment. "Dear Grace," one wrote, "I read your story while recovering from chemo. You reminded me that I'm not just surviving, I'm still living. Thank you." Every letter felt like a thread, weaving her back into the fabric of a world she'd once thought had no place for her. Samuel often joked, "You've built a better community online than I ever did in academia." She'd smile and answer, "Because mine starts with listening, not lecturing." One evening in late summer, a storm rolled in, thick clouds, flashes of lightning, the smell of rain-soaked soil. Grace and Samuel sat by the fire, reading. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Samuel rose to check the fuse box. But before he could, a deafening crack split the air. A bolt of lightning struck a nearby pine. Flames leapt, wild and red, catching the dry leaves near the porch. For a heartbeat, Grace froze, the past rushing back like smoke through her veins. The fire, the heat, the suffocating panic. "Samuel," she shouted, rushing to the window. He was already there, grabbing the extinguisher, his movements calm and measured. She ran outside behind him, the rain pelting her face, the storm roaring overhead. Together, they fought the small blaze until the rain finished what they started. When it was over, they stood soaked, gasping, watching steam rise from the blackened ground. Grace's hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, recognition. The fire had come again. But this time, it hadn't destroyed, it had only reminded her how far she'd come. Samuel turned to her, brushing wet hair from her face. "You okay?" She laughed, breathless. "I think the universe just likes its metaphors." He grinned. "Then I'm glad it sent you a gentler one this time." They stood there, holding each other as the storm faded into drizzle. The rain washed away the soot, leaving behind a circle of damp earth, black, but alive. The next morning, Grace went to her desk and began to write. "I used to think fire was punishment. Now I know it's an invitation, to rebuild, to reimagine, to rise. The first one took my house. The second one showed me I was never homeless. Because home isn't walls or roofs, it's the heart that still chooses hope after everything burns." She titled it, "The Fire of Renewal." When she posted it, the comments flooded in within hours. One read simply, "I lost everything in the Maui fires last year. Your words gave me a reason to start again." Grace cried as she read, her tears falling onto the keyboard. Samuel came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "You did it again," he whispered. She shook her head. "No, the fire did. I just translated." A week later, she framed something new for Samuel's office, beside the frost book. The bell, and their wedding photo. It was the old business card she had found all those months ago in the ashes. Now cleaned and pressed behind glass. "Randall Galloway," it had once said in faded blue ink. But beneath it, she'd written in her own hand, "Samuel Reed, the man who remembered how to listen." He smiled when he saw it. "You renamed me." "I just corrected history," she said playfully. They spent the afternoon planting new rose bushes where the fire had scorched the ground. As they worked, Grace looked up at the sky, still streaked with clouds but glowing in the light of the setting sun. "Funny," she murmured, "the first fire ended my life. The second one started it." Samuel pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Maybe that's how it always works. We lose one story so we can live the one we were meant to write." That night, as the stars blinked into view, Grace sat on the porch with her laptop, finishing the final entry of her blog. "If you are reading this, and everything feels lost, wait. Sometimes, the fire is not the end. It's the beginning disguised as light." She clicked publish, closed her laptop, and leaned against Samuel's shoulder. The night was quiet, the air cool and sweet. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Because she had learned, through ashes, love, and time, that everything that burns isn't meant to end. Some flames are meant to guide you home. The storm had passed, but the smell of smoke lingered faintly in the air, not the heavy, suffocating scent of destruction, but a faint whisper of something old being transformed. The rain had rinsed the ashes into the soil, and sunlight was already cutting through the trees, streaking Samuel's garden with gold. Grace stepped outside barefoot, her coffee warming her hands. She inhaled deeply, pine, rain, and a trace of fire. The world, she thought, always smells like rebirth after it burns. Samuel joined her on the porch, towel draped over his shoulder, his hair still damp from his morning shower. "You're up early," he said softly. "I couldn't sleep," Grace replied. "The air feels different today." He nodded. "It always does, after the world reminds us we're temporary." She smiled faintly. "You make it sound poetic." He sipped his coffee. "I had to. You stole all the good metaphors." They walked together to the edge of the garden. where the storm had left its mark. A blackened patch of soil stretched where the flames had flared up the night before. Samuel knelt down, touching the earth gently, then looked up at her. "Look," he said, pointing to something small and green poking through the soot. A sprout. Delicate, defiant, alive. Grace crouched beside him, her breath catching. "Already? Nature doesn't waste time grieving," Samuel said quietly. "It just begins again." The words hit her harder than she expected. She thought of her own life, how she, too, had sprouted again after fire. How the things she thought had ended had only shifted shape. "Maybe," she whispered, "we're all meant to burn at least once." He looked at her, sunlight spilling across his face. "So that we can bloom better after?" She smiled. "Exactly." Later that day, Grace received an email from a woman named Layla, who ran a foundation for disaster survivors. "Mrs. Reed," it read, "your writing has touched more lives than you know. We're creating a program to support older adults who've lost homes and families, not just financially, but emotionally. Would you consider joining us as a mentor?" Grace read the email twice, tears welling. Samuel found her staring at the screen, hands trembling slightly. "You're being called again," he said softly. She turned to him. "I thought I retired from teaching." "You did," he replied, smiling. "Now you're graduating to healing." She laughed, the sound clear and light. "At 66? At 66, he said, "you finally know what's worth teaching." 2 weeks later, she took the train back to Seattle, the same route she'd traveled months ago. But everything felt different now. She sat by the window, her reflection no longer ghost-like but radiant. When the train passed the charred remains of her old neighborhood, she didn't flinch. The lot where her apartment once stood was now an empty patch of land, cordoned off by a temporary fence. Yet, instead of pain, she felt a strange tenderness. She whispered to herself, "Thank you." Not for what she lost, but for what losing had allowed her to find. When she returned to Portland that evening, Samuel was waiting at the station, again in his blue scarf. Again smiling. "This feels familiar," he said. Grace laughed. "Only this time, I know where I'm going." He offered his arm. "Then let's go home, Mrs. Reed." She took it gladly. That night, they hosted a small gathering at the house, friends, neighbors, and volunteers from the foundation. There was laughter, wine, and music drifting softly through the air. Someone asked how they met, and Grace told the story: the fire, the email, the train, the blue scarf. When she finished, there was a silence, then applause, not polite, but genuine. People weren't clapping for romance, they were clapping for survival, for hope. Later, as the guests left and the candles burned low, Samuel turned to her. "You know, for years I lectured about empathy. You wrote one blog and changed more hearts than I ever did." She smiled. "You studied empathy, Samuel. I lived it." Before bed, she walked once more to the garden. The stars shimmered above the dark forest, and in the patch of burned soil, more tiny sprouts were emerging, green veins of resilience threading through black earth. She knelt, touching the ground with reverence. "You survived too," she whispered. Behind her, Samuel's voice was gentle. "Everything that's meant to grow finds a way." She turned and smiled at him. "Even love?" "Especially love," he said. They stood there, hand in hand, the night air cool around them, the stars endless overhead. And for the first time since the fire, Grace understood. She had never really been rebuilding a house, or a life. She had been rebuilding faith. Not faith in miracles, but in the quiet, ordinary power of starting again. The next morning, she sat down to write one last entry for her blog. "This will be my final post," she typed. "Not because my story is over, but because it no longer needs telling. I began writing to find myself after everything burned. But somewhere along the way, I found all of you, and that became my home. If you are lost, keep walking. If you are broken, keep breathing. If you are afraid, remember, fire does not end what it touches. It transforms it." She hit publish, closed her laptop, and smiled. Outside, the garden glowed in morning light, full of color. full of life, full of everything that had once seemed impossible to recover. Grace looked toward Samuel and whispered, "Home, at last." He nodded, his voice barely above a breath. "Always." And in the stillness that followed, the world seemed to exhale, as if even the universe agreed that the lesson was complete. A year passed, not swiftly, not dramatically, but softly. Like snow that settles without sound. The seasons folded over one another, each one gentler than the last. Grace turned 67 that winter. And when Samuel asked her how it felt, she simply said, like the right age to be alive. They had built a life that wasn't grand, but sacred in its simplicity. Morning walks through the forest. Afternoons spent tending the garden. Evenings writing or listening to old jazz records. Some nights they didn't speak at all. They didn't have to. Silence, when shared with the right person, becomes a language. One Sunday, Grace hosted a small group from the foundation, survivors of floods, wildfires, hurricanes, people carrying their own losses, arriving with stories written in their eyes. They gathered around the fireplace, and Grace began not with advice, but with honesty. "I'm not here to teach you how to rebuild," she said softly. "I'm here to remind you that you already know how." A woman named Teresa, who had lost her husband and home in a wildfire, asked through tears, "How do you stop the fear? The nights are the hardest." Grace took her hand. "You don't stop it, you learn to sit beside it until it softens. Fear is just grief wearing armor. Once it knows you won't run, it starts to trust you again." The group fell silent, not from sadness, but recognition. After the meeting, Samuel found her sitting on the porch, watching the light fade. "You were extraordinary," he said. She shook her head. "No, I just spoke the truth." "That is extraordinary," he replied. He handed her a small wooden box. Inside lay an old brass key attached to a silver chain. "What's this?" she asked. "A key to something I've been working on," he said, eyes twinkling. The next morning, he led her down a forest path behind the house. The air was crisp, the sun spilling through tall pines. After a 10-minute walk, they reached a small wooden cottage, fresh paint, open windows, and a sign above the door that read, "The Renewal House." Grace turned to him, eyes wide. "Samuel, what is this?" "It's for them," he said quietly. "For anyone who needs a place to start again. Survivors, widows, wanderers. You gave them hope with your words. Now we'll give them space to heal." Her voice broke. "You built this?" "With some help," he smiled, "but it's your heart that designed it." Inside, the cottage smelled of cedar and lavender. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with donated novels. There was a writing desk, a few framed photographs, and a quilt folded neatly on a bed by the window. Grace ran her fingers along the wooden table. "It's beautiful." Samuel stood beside her. "You always said home was a feeling. I thought maybe we could make a place that teaches people to feel home again." Tears welled in her eyes. "Samuel, this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done for me." He smiled softly. "It's not for you, Grace. It's because of you." That night, as they sat on the porch outside the cottage, the world felt vast and quiet. A soft wind rustled the trees, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of spring. Grace leaned against him. "Do you think people will come?" He chuckled. "People always come to where there's warmth." She smiled. "Then we'll never run out." Months passed, and the Renewal House became exactly what its name promised. Survivors came, from fires, floods, and heartbreak. They came to rest, to write, to learn how to breathe again. Grace met every one of them at the door, her presence calm and grounding. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they just needed to sit in silence. Sometimes they left small gifts, a painting, a poem, a pressed flower, on the porch as thanks. And every time someone new arrived, Grace lit a candle in the window. Not as a ritual, but as a symbol. A way of saying, "You're not lost anymore, you're just arriving." On the first anniversary of her fire, she wrote a final journal entry, not online, not for the world, but in a leather-bound notebook she kept beside her bed. "Exactly 1 year ago, I stood in the ashes of everything I thought defined me. I believed I was finished. But fire, I've learned, is not an ending. It's a teacher. It strips away everything false until only truth remains. I lost my home to find my purpose. I lost my fear to find my faith. And I lost my loneliness to find a love that waited through 40 winters. She closed the notebook, tied its ribbon, and placed it on the shelf beside the bell and the photograph of her and Samuel standing before the renewal house, laughing as if time had finally surrendered. That evening, as twilight fell, Samuel took her hand. "Do you realize," he said, "we built a home out of everything the world tried to take?" Grace smiled. "That's what love does, Samuel. It rebuilds quietly while no one's watching." They sat there, the candles flickering in the cottage window, the forest whispering its eternal hymn. Somewhere far away, another fire might have been burning, but here, in this small corner of the world, two souls sat side by side, wrapped in peace, proof that even from ruin, beauty can rise again. And for Grace, who had once thought her story was over, life had written a quiet, luminous epilogue, one where hope didn't scream. It simply stayed.